checks out because, as Senator Schumer has said, this is not a blue and red fight. And B, to make the reforms that are necessary so this never happens again. Too many banks looked the other way. Too many auditors decided this wasn't important. This was again and again a textbook case of disinterest in suffering and families and young girls, and we're not going to let it happen again.
We're also not going to bifurcate this. It's part of one large...
You just watched Senator Ron Wyden stand before the cameras and declare that too many banks looked the other way, while Jeffrey Epstein trafficked young girls, and you need to understand that this is not some discrete scandal from the past waiting to be catalogued and filed away in the history books, because right now, at this very moment, as we speak, the entire architecture of American financial power is actively working to bury the full truth about who enabled Epstein and who profited from his crimes, and who remains protected by the same institutions that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of predation. And I'm about to take you through the most explosive investigation that almost nobody in mainstream media wants to touch with a 10-foot pole, because it implicates not just one political party, but the entire edifical structure of elite impunity that has been constructed over decades to ensure that the powerful never face consequences for their sins. Senator Wyden introduced the Produce Epstein Treasury Records Act to compel Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to turn over Epstein-related Treasury records to Senate investigator. And here's what you need to grasp about this moment, because Bessent has repeatedly refused to produce them to the committee and downplayed their significance, even though the files detail Epstein transactions totaling at least $1.5 billion, and they include the names of women and girls he may have trafficked, as well as the identities of individuals whose involvement with Epstein may put them at risk of blackmail or other foreign corruption. And this is not some abstract bureaucratic turf war. This is a deliberate, calculated effort by powerful people to keep the American public in the dark about a global sex trafficking operation that was funded by billionaires and facilitated by the largest financial institutions in the world, and we are going to tear through every layer of this cover-up, because the bombshells just keep coming. Wyden's team found 4,700 wire transfers with details about women and girls being trafficked, and let that number sink into your consciousness for a moment, because we're talking about 4,700 wire individual financial transactions that should have set off alarm bells at every single compliance department at every single major bank, and yet nothing happened. And when I say nothing happened, I mean that a major U.S. bank flagged more than $170 million in payments to Epstein 7 years late, only after Epstein had already died in his cell. And this is not incompetence. This is not bureaucratic delay. This is willful blindness in service of profit, because these banks were making millions in fees from Epstein's accounts, and they didn't want to lose that revenue stream, even if it meant enabling the systematic abuse of children, and this should make your blood absolutely boil. The scale of institutional complicity here demands that we name names and follow the money with unrelenting precision. So let me walk you through what Wyden's investigation has uncovered, because J.P. Morgan Chase executives overruled internal warnings over the course of several years to maintain deep ties with Jeffrey Epstein, and bank compliance officers raised concerns about Epstein repeatedly with senior executives. And we're not talking about low-level employees here, because emails between executives related to those concerns were marked pending Dimon review, and for Jamie, which means that Jamie Dimon, the CEO of the largest bank in America, may have personally known about Epstein's suspicious activity, and the bank kept him as a client anyway. And then here's where it gets even more obscene, because when J.P. Morgan finally ended its relationship with Epstein in 2013, the bank acted based on the understanding that he posed an unacceptable risk of money laundering and human trafficking, concerns that should have motivated the bank to immediately flag his suspicious transactions to federal regulators, as required by law. But instead, a bank provided no explanation as to why it waited 6 years after it fired Epstein as a client to file suspicious activity reports on his transactions that appeared to be related to sex trafficking, and this 6-year delay is not a mistake. It's obstruction of justice dressed up in corporate letterhead. What we're witnessing here is the crystallization of everything progressives have been warning about for years, which is that our financial system operates as a protection racket for the ultra-wealthy, where the rules that apply to ordinary people simply evaporate when you have enough money and the right connections. The Treasury records shine a light on how high-profile individuals paid Epstein staggering sums of money, which was then used to move women around the world, or engage in dubious transactions indicative of money laundering, and they show how U.S. financial institutions turned a blind eye to the financing of Epstein's criminal network. And this is why Ron Wyden is absolutely correct when he says this is not a blue and red fight, because the rot goes so deep that it transcends partisan politics and implicates the entire structure of how power operates in America. But let's be clear about who is blocking accountability right now at this very moment, because Bessent twice this year has refused to provide these records to the Finance Committee, making him a willing participant in the Trump administration's Epstein cover-up. And we need to say that part loudly for the people in the back, because while both parties may have failed in the past, the current obstruction is coming directly from Trump's Treasury Secretary. The philosophical framework we need to apply here draws directly from Michel Foucault's analysis of power and knowledge, because what we're seeing is not just individual criminals evading justice, but rather an entire epistemic regime that determines what can be known and by whom, and the Treasury Department sitting on these files is an exercise in sovereign power that says the American people are not entitled to know how their financial system enabled child trafficking, and this connects to what political theorist Sheldon Wolin called inverted totalitarianism, where corporate power has essentially captured democratic institutions and rendered them incapable of holding elites accountable. If you think I'm being hyperbolic, consider that Wyden said the basic question is whether a bunch of rich pedophiles and Epstein accomplices are going to face any consequences for their crimes, and Scott Bessent is doing his best to make sure they won't. And his head just about exploded when he heard Bessent say it wasn't his department's job to investigate these Epstein bank records, because that is the language of elite impunity speaking through the mask of procedural neutrality. Now we need to drill down into the specific mechanisms of how this system works, because it's not enough to say banks enabled Epstein, we need to understand the precise ways that compliance systems failed, or more accurately were designed to fail, when the client is wealthy enough and J.P. Morgan turned a blind eye to evidence of Jeffrey Epstein's child sex trafficking for over 15 years, and senior executives at the bank helped Epstein open 134 accounts and processed over $1 billion in transactions for Epstein, including after his 2008 conviction for soliciting minors. And think about what that means, that even after Epstein was a convicted sex offender, J.P. Morgan continued to provide him with banking services and facilitate his transactions, which means that someone at that bank made a conscious decision that the reputational and legal risk of banking a pedophile was worth whatever fees they were collecting. And this is capitalism in its most naked form, where literally everything, including the safety of children, is subordinated to the logic of profit accumulation. The historical parallel we need to invoke here is the way that Swiss banks facilitated Nazi gold transfers during World War II, because in both cases you have financial institutions that claim neutrality and hide behind client confidentiality, while actively enabling mass atrocities, and just as it took decades and enormous political pressure to force Swiss banks to account for their role in the Holocaust, we are seeing the same pattern of institutional resistance when it comes to the Epstein scandal. J.P. Morgan's report highlights over $1 billion in transactions Epstein engaged in from October 2003 until July 2019, with numerous related companies, Wall Street titans, his former lawyer and others, which means there is a whole network of people who were receiving money from Epstein's accounts, and those names are in the Treasury files that Scott Bessent is refusing to release. And this brings us to the question of who exactly is being protected. Wyden laid out that the DOJ should investigate why several ultra-wealthy Wall Street financiers paid Jeffrey Epstein hundreds of millions of dollars, including billionaire Leon Black, who paid Epstein $170 million for purported tax and estate planning advice, far more than other professional attorneys and advisors involved in Black's estate planning. And this is where the conspiracy theories start to look less like conspiracy and more like documented fact, because $170 million for tax advice is not a plausible explanation, it's an obvious cover story, and what makes this even more damning is that a major U.S. bank flagged more than $170 million in payments to Epstein 7 years late, only after Epstein had already died in his cell, which suggests that the bank knew these payments were suspicious all along, but chose not to report them until after Epstein could no longer implicate anyone, and this is consciousness of guilt written in financial records. We also need to talk about the international dimensions of this, because the Treasury Department's Epstein file contains information indicating that Epstein used several now sanctioned Russian banks for hundreds of millions of dollars in wire transfers, and it appears that these wire transfers were correlated to the movement of women or girls around the world, and this is where the story explodes beyond sex trafficking into potential espionage and compromat, because if Epstein was using Russian banks to move money while trafficking women to powerful men, that creates obvious vectors for foreign intelligence services to collect blackmail material, and this is exactly the kind of national security threat that should have every single person in Washington demanding full disclosure, but instead we get stonewalling from the Treasury Department, and you have to ask yourself why. the answer brings us back to elite impunity, which, while Trumpian corruption is striking in frequency and scale, was the logical endpoint of the long-standing tradition of elite impunity, because for the past half-century corporate and white-collar crime have gone largely unenforced, and this creates an environment where someone like Jeffrey Epstein can operate openly for decades because everyone in positions of power understands that there are two justice systems in America, one for us and one for them. Larry Summers was able to lay waste to America's working class, and yet keep all of his fancy academic, media, corporate, and political credentials, giving him little reason to think he'd face consequences for palling around with Jeffrey Epstein. And this gets to the core dysfunction of our political economy, which is that the people who make the rules are part of the same social class as the people who break them, and therefore have no incentive to enforce accountability. This is why Wyden's investigation is so critical, because he is trying to do what the Department of Justice has refused to do, which is follow the money. Wyden wrote that he is convinced the DOJ ignored evidence found in the U.S. Treasury Department's Epstein file, which contains extensive details on the mountains of cash Epstein received from prominent businessmen that Epstein used to finance his criminal network. And when a sitting senator has to publicly accuse the DOJ of ignoring evidence in a sex trafficking case that should be a 5-alarm fire for our democracy, but instead it gets buried on page A17, while the media obsesses over whatever manufactured controversy is trending on social media, and this is how elite crimes get memory hold. The public attention span is deliberately fragmented so that systemic corruption never stays in focus long enough for accountability to take root. Let me be absolutely clear about the bipartisan nature of this failure, because Wyden said he pushed very, very hard to get the Biden people to do more, and that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's agency felt they were providing transparency when they allowed staff to see the suspicious activity reports even if just for several hours, and that is pathetic. That is regulator theater that allows the Biden administration to claim cooperation while ensuring that no one can actually do a thorough investigation, and this is exactly the kind of performative oversight that progressives have been criticizing for years, where Democrats talk a good game about accountability, then protect the same Wall Street interests that Republicans openly defend, and the result is that nothing fundamentally changes, no matter who is in power, because both parties are captured by the financial industry. But here's where it gets interesting, because we're now seeing some genuine fractures in that consensus, as Wyden expressed extreme concern that Trump and Bondi are faking investigations as a pretext to block any further disclosures, and this is the worst possible outcome, where the appearance of investigation is used as cover for continued cover-up, and we've seen this playbook before with the 9/11 Commission and the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, where official investigations are carefully stage-managed to avoid implicating anyone too powerful, and the Epstein case is following the exact same pattern, where the DOJ says no such client list exists, which is technically true in the sense that there probably isn't a document titled client list, but functionally false because the Treasury records contain all the information needed to identify everyone who gave money to Epstein and everyone who received money from him, which is the same thing. The victims of this cover-up are not abstract, they are real human beings who deserved protection from our institutions and instead got betrayed, and women who were victimized by Epstein rallied in Washington, D.C., and called on the federal government to release records related to Epstein, and these women have been fighting for years to get justice, while banks and government agencies hide behind claims of confidentiality and national security. And this is why we need to understand the Epstein scandal as fundamentally about power, because at every level the system chose to protect powerful men instead of vulnerable girls, and that choice was not accidental. It flowed directly from the structure of our political economy, which values wealth above all else, and treats human beings as disposable commodities. The banking dimension of this scandal also reveals something profound about how compliance systems are supposed to work versus how they actually work, because, under the Bank Secrecy Act, financial institutions are required to file suspicious activity reports within 60 days of detecting transactions that raise red flags. Yet all 4 banks with close financial ties to Jeffrey Epstein repeatedly failed to take timely action for years, potentially allowing his criminal activity to remain undetected. And this is not a failure of the system. This is the system working exactly as designed, because compliance departments exist primarily to protect the bank, not to protect the public, and when there is a conflict between filing a SAR that might lose a lucrative client and looking the other way, the incentive structure is crystal clear. Bank of America profited by earning interest commissions, service fees, and other financial benefits directly from its connection with Epstein, and every dollar they made came from enabling trafficking. We need to expand our analysis here to understand this as part of a broader crisis of accountability in neoliberal capitalism, Because what we're seeing with Epstein is the same dynamic that played out with the financial crisis, where the people who crashed the global economy faced no consequences, with the opioid epidemic, where the Sackler family got to keep billions while hundreds of thousands died, or with climate change, where fossil fuel executives have known for decades they were destroying the planet and continued anyway. And in every case, the mechanism is the same. Wealthy people use their power to capture regulatory agencies and law enforcement, and then commit crimes with impunity. Institutions like the European Public Prosecutor's Office and European Anti-Fraud Office have improved coordination but lack binding enforcement powers and cannot fully address entrenched impunity. And this is a global phenomenon where the rich have effectively seceded from the social contract and exist in a separate reality where laws don't apply. The question then becomes what is to be done, and this is where we need to think seriously about structural reforms that go beyond individual prosecutions, because even if we manage to hold every single person who enabled Epstein accountable tomorrow, the underlying system that allowed it to happen would remain intact. Calls for Democrats to find their way back from the wilderness by forcefully rebuking corporate influence and corruption are multiplying, and politicians like Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff and Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy are emerging as anti-corruption champions. But to mount a real anti-corruption agenda, Democrats must go farther than just condemning Trump world. And this is absolutely correct, because performative outrage against Trump is cheap and easy. The hard work is confronting the bipartisan consensus around financial deregulation and elite impunity that both parties have upheld for decades. What Wyden is calling for is revolutionary in its implications, even if it's framed in procedural language, because Wyden's view has been that following the money is the key to identifying Epstein's clients, as well as the henchmen and banks that enabled his sex trafficking network. And if we actually did that, if we actually traced every dollar that flowed through Epstein's accounts and investigated every person and institution that facilitated his crimes, we would be forced to confront the fact that the entire upper echelon of American society is complicit in systematic exploitation, and that conclusion is so threatening to the established order that every possible mechanism is being deployed to prevent us from reaching it, which is why Besant has refused to provide these records to the Finance Committee, and why the DOJ released what Wyden described as obviously not a real investigation into the funding of Epstein's sex trafficking operation. Now I want to talk about what this means for congressional oversight more broadly, because we're seeing a fundamental breakdown in the separation of powers, where the executive branch simply refuses to comply with legislative requests for information. The Fed has repeatedly ignored subpoenas and sidestepped congressional inquiries, and this is not unique to financial regulation. This is happening across the board, where agencies that are supposed to be accountable to Congress act as if they're accountable to no one, and the only way to break this bolt at pace is through aggressive use of congressional power, including inherent contempt and budget cuts, and public hearings that make it politically impossible for officials to continue stonewalling, but that requires a level of political will that frankly most Democrats don't have, because they're afraid of being labeled partisan or destabilizing important institutions, and that deference is exactly what allows corruption to flourish. The media's role in all of this also deserves scrutiny, because the New York Times Magazine published an in-depth investigation revealing how high-level executives at J.P. Morgan Chase enabled Epstein's criminal enterprise for years, and the vested interests they had in turning a blind eye. And that's good journalism. But where was that investigation, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when it might have actually made a difference? And the answer is that major media outlets have their own relationships with Wall Street, and their own conflicts of interest, and their own class biases that make them reluctant to pursue stories that implicate the entire elite establishment. And this is why we need independent media, and why we need journalists who are willing to follow the story wherever it leads, even if it makes powerful people uncomfortable. I also want to address the international dimension here, because 2 accounts included in the report were linked to Russian banks, Alpha Bank and Superbank, and this raises profound questions about whether Epstein was operating as an intelligence asset for foreign governments, or whether his operation was penetrated by foreign intelligence or both. And these are not theoretical concerns, because if you're a foreign intelligence service, and you know that a wealthy American is trafficking girls to powerful men, that is the single most valuable intelligence asset you could possibly have. And the fact that our government agencies don't seem interested in investigating this possibility is either incompetence on a staggering scale, or evidence that they already know the answer and don't want it public. The connection to broader patterns of elite corruption is unmistakable because elite privilege defined as access to subsidies, tax relief, and lucrative state contracts for a select few drains billions of dollars from economies annually, and findings from a UNDP report said economic privileges granted to elite groups amount to roughly 6% of some countries' economies, and while that's talking about Pakistan, the same dynamics apply here, where politically connected elites use their access to extract wealth from the public and face no accountability, and the Epstein case is the most grotesque example of this, because what he was extracting wasn't just money, it was the bodies of young girls, and he was able to do it because he had the protection of wealthy and powerful men who benefited from his operation. Let's talk about what accountability would actually look like, because it's not enough to say we want justice, we need to be specific about what that means, and at minimum it means, given the scale of Epstein's trafficking operation and all the money involved, it's unacceptable that only he and Maxwell have faced prosecution, and complicit banks ought to be investigated, as should anybody who helped Epstein traffic his victims or took part in the abuse. And that's correct. But we also need structural reforms that make this kind of institutional complicity impossible in the future. And that means breaking up banks that are too big to jail, and creating independent prosecutors who can't be fired by the people they're investigating, and mandating real-time disclosure of suspicious activity reports to Congress, and eliminating the statute of limitations for sex trafficking, and creating a private right of action so victims can sue banks. And this is not radical. This is the bare minimum required to have a functional system of accountability. The philosophical question at the heart of this scandal is whether we actually believe in equality before the law, or whether that's just rhetoric we use to legitimate a fundamentally hierarchical system. The assumption of elite impunity was built on decades of precedent, and reached its apex under some regimes where corruption was woven into the very fabric of governance. And we're seeing the same pattern here, where the impunity is so normalized that it's barely even hidden anymore, and Treasury Secretary Besant can just openly refuse to provide documents to Congress and face no consequences, and this is what democratic backsliding looks like. It's not tanks in the streets, it's the slow erosion of accountability mechanisms until we reach a point where the powerful can do literally anything and get away with it. I want to return to Wyden's statement that this is not a blue and red fight because that framing is politically astute, but it also needs to be interrogated, because while it's true that both parties have failed on this issue, it's also true that right now in December 2025, Oregon Senator Ron Wyden is spearheading his own investigation into institutions he accuses of shielding Epstein by failing to report his suspicious financial activities, and he told AFP they need both lanes because he doesn't trust Bondi, and following the money is how they've had a long history of catching and rooting out corrupt behavior, and the reason he doesn't trust Bondi is because Trump and his allies long alleged that powerful Democrats and Hollywood liberals were being shielded from accountability for their involvement, but the president dismissed the transparency push as a Democrat hoax as soon as he returned to office and acquired the unilateral authority to release the files, and that tells you everything you need to know about Trump's actual commitment to accountability, which is zero. The survivors of Epstein's trafficking deserve to know who enabled their abuse, and the American people deserve to know how their financial system was weaponized to facilitate trafficking. Trump's signature started a 30-day timer for Attorney General Pam Bondi to publicly release unclassified files relating to Epstein and his convicted accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell, and a bipartisan group of 5 lawmakers asked Bondi for a briefing and status update on DOJ's efforts, and we are rapidly approaching that deadline, and the question is whether we're going to get real disclosure or another whitewash, and based on everything we know about how power operates in America, I think we can guess the answer, but that doesn't mean we should stop demanding accountability. The systematic nature of the cover-up is what makes this so damning, because emails show J.P. Morgan private bankers withheld information on Epstein's suspicious activity from the bank's compliance department, which means there was a deliberate effort inside the bank to prevent the compliance system from working, and that's not a failure, that's corruption, and the executives who ordered or allowed that to happen should be facing criminal charges, and the fact that they're not tells you exactly how broken our justice system is. The bank failed completely, and its failure enabled Jeffrey Epstein's horrific crimes and abuse of women and girls to continue for years, and every single person involved in that failure should be held accountable, not just morally, but legally. We also need to discuss the role of auditors and lawyers who facilitated Epstein's operation, because Epstein's accountant Harry Beller was an integral part of Epstein's financial operation, and his potential links to sex trafficking crimes merit further investigation. And this is typical of how white-collar crime works, where there's a whole infrastructure of professionals who enable the crime, and then hide behind claims of attorney-client privilege or accountant-client confidentiality, and we need to eliminate those protections when the underlying activity is criminal, because lawyers and accountants should not be allowed to facilitate trafficking, and then claim they were just doing their job. The payment to Ghislaine Maxwell is particularly revealing because Jeffrey Epstein paid Ghislaine Maxwell at least $25 million, including a one-time payment of $19 million from his accounts at JP Morgan, and that is not a salary that is paying someone to be a co-conspirator, and the bank processed that payment, which means someone at JP Morgan saw a $19 million wire transfer to Maxwell and decided it wasn't suspicious enough to report, and that defies credibility unless you understand that the bank was actively protecting Epstein rather than just failing to notice his crimes. As we approach the conclusion of this analysis, I want to emphasize what's at stake here, because this is not just about one dead pedophile and his enablers. This is about whether we are going to have a society governed by law or a society governed by power, and right now we are clearly in the latter category, where tactics foster a climate of impunity, and when institutions responsible for oversight and accountability are threatened, weakened, or politicized, corruption becomes entrenched and significantly harder to dismantle. And that's exactly what we're seeing, where every institution that should be investigating has been captured or intimidated into silence. The congressional response to this scandal will be a test of whether democratic accountability is still possible. The House Oversight Committee is committed to providing accountability and transparency to the American people and the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's horrific crimes, and that's what they should be doing. But we need to watch carefully to make sure this doesn't turn into another partisan circus where Republicans use it to attack Democrats, and Democrats use it to attack Trump, and nobody actually gets to the bottom of what happened, because both parties are protecting their own people. What Senator Wyden is doing deserves our full support because he is trying to use his institutional power to force disclosure against massive resistance from the executive branch and the banking industry. And that takes courage, and we need more elected officials who are willing to stand up and demand answers, even when it's politically inconvenient, and even when it threatens powerful interests. And the fact that he's been working on this investigation for 3 years with relatively little media attention tells you how thoroughly our political discourse has been captured by elite interests who don't want this story to gain traction. The ultimate lesson here is that elite accountability doesn't happen by accident. It has to be fought for and won against enormous resistance from people who benefit from the current system, and that fight requires sustained pressure from below, from movements and activists and journalists who refuse to let this story die, and who keep demanding answers until the full truth comes out, and justice is done. And right now in December 2025, as we watch Scott Bessent's Stonewall Congress and Pam Bondi run out the clock, and JP Morgan hide behind settlements that contained no admission of wrongdoing, we are losing that fight. But the fight is not over, and it won't be over until every single person who enabled Jeffrey Epstein faces consequences, and every institution that protected him is reformed or dismantled, and until we live in a society where the same laws apply to billionaires as to everyone else, and where trafficking survivors can actually get justice instead of being told that the files they need are classified or privileged, or simply unavailable because powerful people don't want them released. This is what democratic renewal looks like. It's the hard grinding work of forcing transparency and demanding accountability even when every institution is aligned against you, and it's the only way we're ever going to break the cycle of elite impunity that has poisoned our democracy for far too long.